Carrying old memories into a new life can feel like you're trying to lead a mission without a team. You keep showing up for work, your family, and everyone else, but sometimes the weight of that previous life stays with you until that weight starts taking over. There is a better way to face it, though. Our guest today, Brendan Kelly, brings a hard earned perspective from 22 years in the Army, after retirement, mental health treatment, and the writing that helped him turn silence into something useful for others. In this episode, we're going to give you a grounded look at transition out of the military, PTSD, family, therapy, and finding a mission after the uniform comes off. Before we get into this episode, though, I want to give everyone just a little bit of information to raise awareness about something that's deeply important to our community, the Global War on Terrorism Memorial Foundation. This organization is working to build a permanent national memorial in Washington, D.C. to honor the service members, families, and civilians who were impacted by the global war on terrorism. This memorial will be both a tribute to those who have served and a way to ensure that their sacrifices are recognized and remembered for generations to come. If you'd like to learn more or find out how you can support their mission, visit gwatmemorialfoundation.org. Now let's get into today's episode. Hey, Brendan, welcome to the show. Really glad to have you here.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate being on the show and look forward to a good conversation.
Yeah, me too. Before we get into the conversation, would you mind sharing a little bit about yourself and your background for the listeners who are familiar with you and who you are?
Absolutely. I'll give the cliff notes. So, retired Army, active duty for 22 years. Then after that, I taught high school for a bit, worked in the corporate world, and, through some of my challenges I had that we'll get into, I started writing, and that's when I really found my niche and started putting things together. And, I'm fortunate to have a supportive wife of 33 years and 3 amazing daughters, and here we are now, Scott.
Yes. And, it's interesting to me too, because so many veterans have trouble when they transition out of the military. They go from that structured environment, they have the camaraderie, they have support, they have all the resources there that they need. I know all the time we kind of bitch about the pay is not great and all that kind of stuff, but but there's a lot of other things we have going for us in the military, and then we get out and we're pretty much all on our own, and then we're trying to figure out what's job going to be like, how do I even apply for a job? A lot of us joined the military at 18 and never really had to apply for jobs or go on interviews and those types of things. There's so much stuff that goes into it that we're just not prepared for. You oftentimes find people bouncing from job to job until they either find something that they love, they're calling, kind of like what you're describing, or they just suck it up and deal with the thing that they hate and paying the bills, keeping the lights on and all that kind of stuff. But it's good to find someone who has found something that they enjoy and can continue doing that. Keep the lights on, put the food on the table, all that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
So looking back at your time, I believe you said 22 years in the Army and deployed multiple times, things like that over the course of the time period. Looking back at your time in the Army, what parts of that experience stayed with you the most? After the uniform came off, what are some of the things that you've taken away that you find yourself kind of falling back to your whether it's training or just the environment that you're used to, things like that?
No, and, when you're in the military for 22 years, I don't necessarily like using the word institutionalized, but you get into that rhythm. You know what to expect, whether it's, waking up every morning and do physical training, then you're going to, go to formation, start the work day, close out the day. And there's a group of guys and gals that you can literally depend on. So when I retired, it took some getting used to that, a couple things. One, as a senior non-commissioned officer, I wasn't in charge of anybody anymore, and no commands, no given anything. And you find yourself with time on your hands, and you're used to that very professional, respectful environment. And I'm not knocking the civilian world because, I found my niche, but it is not the same. You know, regardless of what rank you had on your collar in the military, when you go to the civilian world, you're just another person out there, trying to, as we say, keep the lights on and the refrigerator stocked and everything. But I think being able to teach high school was a great transition for me because I didn't manage my classroom in a, authoritarian military style, but I utilized those same techniques to have a rhythm, you know, myself for my students, and they knew what to expect from me and vice versa. So, it worked out nicely.
It's good too, because, I've known teachers, I have teachers in my family and, sometimes hearing the horror stories of what goes on in a classroom. I mean, you have to come up with some sort of system to keep things in line, keep people in check and all that kind of stuff. So it's hard when you don't have that, but then when you're able to kind of fall back on that military way of doing things, that way of thinking and being organized and having some sort sense of order and control over things. But like you said, authoritarian kind of way, just in a way that makes sense and everyone knows what to expect, when to expect it, and all that. And that's kind of the way to do it. I think so that definitely makes sense. But as you transitioned out, a lot of times we think about the service, the past, the things that we had done, but sometimes that transition, like we were talking about, even harder. And when that structure is gone, we want to uh, we want to grab onto something. We want to figure something out. And it seems like that's kind of what you did in those early days. You kind of latched onto making it your own in the classroom, and that's good, I think, to be able to figure that out. 'Cause not everyone does. Sometimes people just they get out there and they just get bitter with the world and people who are around them, their coworkers, their family, their everyone around, and it's not the best way to go continue operating through life. So it's good that you figured some of that stuff out, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I want to add in there, it gave me the opportunity to, focus my mind purely on the teaching, on
Yeah,
the classroom, and what I had to do, as opposed to, you know, all the other things going on in my melon. So,
yeah, right. And you gave yourself a new mission, basically. You have this
exactly.
thing that you're supposed to be doing. You had all these kids in your classroom that were relying on you, whether they wanted to admit it or not. They're relying on you to teach them something, and we've all been sitting in a classroom, not necessarily wanting to be there. And I'm sure, not necessarily that you were a bad teacher or anything like that. That's not what I'm getting at all. But kids are kids, and yeah, they're
Right.
not
Yeah.
always they're not always awake. Let's just put it that way. So yeah, that can be tough, but you still you have that responsibility to them, and they are counting on you to do your job, and so your focus on and focusing your energy on that is kind of where you need to be.
Yeah.
Now, in kind of prep for this episode, I kind of did a little background research and things like that, and found a little bit about you sharing your battles with like PTSD, mental health type things, and you share some of this stuff publicly so that people know that they're not alone. At what point did you decide that you're going to stop keeping these things boxed up, start putting it out there? Whether it's getting the treatment, getting the help that you needed, or even just sharing and talking about it and putting it out there to the world so that other folks know that they're not alone.
Unfortunately, it took a while. I retired in 2010, and it wasn't until, late 2016 when I literally mentally hit rock bottom. And, you know, unfortunately, ready to commit suicide. I was done with it all, just the nightmares and the constant ruminating in my mind. And, I'm very fortunate that my wife had the know-how or thought to reach out to a veterans crisis hotline, and she got me to the hospital. And when I was in the hospital for those 2 weeks and, they were taking care of me, I was getting some initial therapy. That's when I really started talking about my past, started talking about those demons. And I saw what my actions were doing to my wife, my girls, my family and friends. And it kind of clicked like, you know, it may sound strange to say, but I was being selfish. I, you know, I had to get help, not just for me, which by all means, that's the most important, take care of yourself, but so I could be a better husband, a better friend, a better father. So I wouldn't be angry anymore. So I could share with my loved ones what I went through and the things I was dealing with because, I was trying to do it all myself. I was thinking, okay, I can be my own doctor. I can be my own psychiatrist. I can work through this, you know. I mean, I've led, troops into battle. I can do this, but I
Sure.
couldn't. I couldn't.
Right. Yeah, and I think a key thing that you just mentioned there was that, you led troops into battle, but you didn't go charging off on your own as a one-man team, where you were kicking indoors and doing all the things on your own with nobody else with you. And so why should any of the other stuff be different? Why should your, physical and mental health and all the other things that are going on, why should that all fall on your shoulders? You're maybe not an expert, and this is you, but also the listener, you're not necessarily an expert in mental health related issues or physical health related issues. And you might be tough and you might be able to, grin and bear it for a little while, whatever it is that you're going through. But, you can only take so much before you start to crack and you start to break. And, yeah, we kind of train ourselves so that in the moment we can push through we can push through the pain in that moment so we can accomplish the mission and get the mission done. But what you took the uniform off, the mission's done, it's over. Now take a step back and say, okay, what do I need in order to
Yeah.
fix the rest of those things? Because I can't do it. I'm a mechanic. So I take my car in to get serviced.
Yeah.
It's a strange thing. People do that all the time. Now, sure, there's some people out there who know how to do all the stuff when cars making a clanky noise or whatever. They can fix it. Great. You're educated in that type of stuff. I'm not. So I went to do it. I'd probably make the problem even worse. And so why would I think that if I had a mental health issue, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a counselor or anything like that. Oh, I wouldn't make that problem worse either. So, to your point, you kind of hit that rock bottom moment. But, really, if you had, and this is for anyone, it's not just singling you out, but if you had stepped up sooner and said, hey, I need some help to figure this out, you've probably been in a better position, right?
No, absolutely. You know, looking back on those years, if, hindsight's 2020, if I'd have had that knowledge and that mental well-being, I mean, things would gone different. But, things happen for a reason. And it took a while to understand that. And even, as I was going through, mental health training and getting better, when I was in my outpatient program, when they started helping us learn about, cognitive behavioral therapy, understanding, and really giving everything that's in here a voice, getting it out and sharing, and that realizing that was then, it is not now. And being able to accept that, talk through it was powerful. And,
Yeah.
I would tell any veteran or, anybody dealing with a mental health challenge or challenges in life, find someone to talk to, whether it's a best friend that maybe can at least be a sounding board and give you ideas, a spouse or anybody. Because when we keep stuff built in, I don't think people realize how much physical damage that does to us, you know, and we don't want that. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself in a dark place, like where I was and having to go through some serious challenges.
Yeah, it sort of has a ripple effect too when you're dealing with all that stuff and it's affecting you. It also secondhand affects those people who are closest to you and kind of spreads out and not just your core family, the folks that you live with, but your other relatives, your other friends, your coworkers, in the
Oh
case
yeah.
of being a teacher, your students even, potentially could, it's affecting them. And how is that affecting the people in their circle? And is that rippling out from their circle too? And, so going back to something that you had said earlier, how you felt like it was sort of selfish that you were not taking care of yourself and sort of kind of a strange way to do it. But I get it. I mean, because it could have that effect on those other people. It's not just affecting you,
Absolutely.
especially if you had let it go further and you, let's just say, God forbid, you did end up taking your life. How big of an impact would have that had on all those people as well? That would have been even bigger. Yeah. It's not just throwing a little pebble into the lake and seeing the little ripples. It's throwing a whole boulder into the lake, and that's splashing over everything, and that's huge. So, yeah, it's good that you got the help that you needed, and yeah, I'm sure as you're starting to open up and start telling your story, in these therapeutic kind of settings, that are probably starting to realize the power behind getting the story out there too, right? Is that
Oh,
kind
yeah.
of part of your transformation into writing and all that?
Oh, absolutely. Because, initially, you know, writing was a form of therapy. It was
Mhm.
just getting the thoughts out, getting it, on paper, getting it on the laptop. And, it got to a point where I felt, you know, though my story was unique to me, it's not unique to the world,
Sure.
and people out there. So, I felt I had enough I could build upon to make it a bigger story to get out there to people, to let them know, hey, you're not alone. You know, there's people out there, though you may feel you have the blinders on and you're only seeing that darkness in front of you. Hey, there's a light, there's help.
Right. And it's good too. I think part of the reason why I even do this show is to share stories like yours because there's other folks out there who might be struggling and they don't understand that they're not alone, or if they do, that it's just not really clicking with them. And so having someone come on and share that, hey, I went through something similar. Here's my roadmap. You don't necessarily have to walk the exact same steps, but maybe you can kind of find your own path out by using this as kind of a guide. And so I think turning those stories, those even tragedies and things that might have happened, kind of makes the story a little bit more relatable and allows other people to kind of see themselves in that story as well. Again, there's background research and stuff, I found you had a saying which I thought was kind of interesting. Turning scars into stories and silence into sentences was something I came across. I forget exactly where I saw that, but to you, what does that mean in kind of practical terms for you as a writer, as a veteran, as a husband, coworker, all friend, all those things? What does that tagline mean to you?
Hey, it took a while for me to write my little tagline because I wanted it to have an impact for what I went through. And, thinking about, the scars I have. I mean, the things I've done in my military career, in deployments and in life, they're with me forever, just like a scar. But I can now turn those into something positive to help others. And on the silence part, for too long, I kept stuff to myself. My best friend, my spouse, my soulmate, I wouldn't even share those dark, thoughts and memories with her because, you know, I didn't want to put that pressure on her, even though she would have been an amazing help earlier on, because I mean, she's been there for me. But being able to take that silence and now turn them into sentences to add to the story. So, because there are far too many people that have those scars, those mental scars that we can't see, and keeping things silent. And they have to know that someone out there has been through it, been through the similar things. I've gone to war, I've taken a life, you know, sadly, I attempted suicide. eh, but here I am now, by,
Mhm.
the grace of the universe, being able to share this story and let them know you don't have to hit rock bottom to get the help you need or to
Right.
speak to someone.
Yeah. And all too often people do end up hitting that rock bottom moment, and either they get to the point where they attempt suicide and are successful and in that attempt, and they do take their life, or they hit rock bottom, and then it's like a long feels like a long climb back out of that hole whenever they've dug for themselves. And if you can stop that hole from getting any deeper, once when you recognize that there's sort of a problem, it might be a lot less of a climb out of that hole down the line, because you get yourself into a lot of bad habits. You get to the point where you're maybe harming relationships and doing all sorts of things that you really, looking back on it years later, I really wish I didn't do all those things. But you end up getting there, and it just makes it that much harder. So kind of the earlier you can start working on that, the better. And so I think, again, part of the reason why I like to share stories like yours is to let people know that, hey, that's kind of what you need to do. You need to get out there and you need to share your story. You need to get in front of all this, because it's just going to get better on its own. The,
Yeah.
Having another sleepless night is not going to make things better tomorrow. Having
No,
all
no, it
those
doesn't. Yeah.
issues, they're just not going to help things.
Yeah. You know, and then with that, I always want to tell people, speaking to someone, talking to someone, that's the beginning. And I'm going to tell you firsthand, it takes work to get better. You got to put in the effort of changing your ways, changing your thought process, learning. I mean, these days there's so many resources available that can help you find comfort, whether it's, meditating a little bit a day or even reading a little bit about, say, cognitive behavioral therapy and what you need to do, if you're not able to speak to a counselor right away or someone, but it takes work. You've got to be committed to do that work for yourself, your family, your friends, loved ones, and I mean, and when you get on the other end, I mean, it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, so I hear from a lot of people too, is they go to the therapies, and then after a couple sessions, they're like, "This isn't good for me. I'm not getting any better," or anything like that. They get frustrated and they just walk away from it. But it's a lot of work. You have to
Yeah.
do the work. You can't just go there, sit in the therapist's office for an hour a week and expect magic to happen, and then everything is rainbows and unicorns. You're gonna have to go in, and then throughout the week, you're gonna be doing some work. You got to really focus on changing, because if you keep doing the same thing that you've always done and expect some different results, it's kind of crazy. You're not going to see anything different. The only different thing that you're doing is going and talking to a therapist for an hour a week, and you're doing everything else the same. It's not going to really make much difference. You're going to have to do that work outside of therapy as well, outside of therapy sessions, I should say, to
Absolutely.
to get the benefits, I guess.
Yep.
Um, So I want to kind of switch gears just a bit here, and get into your writing and the stuff that you do there. Some of that was, kind of stemmed from that earlier, the therapy process, and writing that took place, and getting it down on paper, or on the computer, wherever it was that you're putting it down on. For you, I imagine there was a therapeutic benefit to the writing, which kind of led you further into that direction to actually become an author and not just writing stuff for the sake of writing it. Became more of a thing that you were more passionate about. Right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. When, you know, I was to a point where I was getting, all these thoughts out and remembering them. And when I felt I had a story, I mean, it kind of literally just clicked. I was looking at my folder of all these writings and I was like, I literally think I have something here. And going back and starting to put it together into a book and then, writing stories about, you know, part of incidents that, you know, I didn't see because there's always, that yin and yang. And, I talk about in my book, about my actions or Jack Mercer, he's the character writing the book, his actions of taking a life in battle. And then in the following chapter, there's the yin and the yang, like I said. Then in next chapters, I talk about, the soldiers on the other side, you know, how their life was, how, they didn't want to go to war. They didn't never want to wear the uniform. They were common people in their community trying to live until, a dictator came around saying, hey, you're either going to serve or we're going to, do some bad things to your family.
Sure.
And, being on the ground in Iraq and Kuwait and, you know, around the world, you hear those stories. So that helped me to put together the pieces of the book and really say, okay, here's something of quality that I can get out there. And then, of course, the next task is finding a publisher that, believes in you as well. So that took a little bit of work, but, it was interesting, despite all the no's, I found that yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and it only takes one yes too, right? There's a lot of times you'll get no's in life, and it's not just finding a publisher for a book. It could be any number of other things you get a lot of no's for, but oftentimes all you need is the one yes, and that
Yeah.
can make a world of difference. So, just because you've gotten 2 or 3 no's in a row or 4, 5, 6, whatever, doesn't mean it's not the right thing. It's maybe not the right fit with a particular person or group or
Exactly.
whoever that you were with. I think even the author of Harry Potter went to
Oh,
several
yeah.
different
Yeah.
publishers and got turned away multiple times, and
Yeah.
now all of a sudden it's an international success. It's, making of money, and, people are still reading it all, to this
Yeah.
day, and, it's amazing. It's just a little bit of perseverance, to kind of push through, especially if you believe in the work and it's solid and you know that there's something good there. Yeah, stick with it. Now, from your perspective, what made you go in the direction of fiction versus writing, like a memoir or speaking more in a direct nonfiction format?
When I was putting the book together, you know, the book became not just about me. Granted, a
Mhm.
lot of what Jack Mercer goes through is, what I went through. But, there's more to the story. And, the story I developed, about, the soldiers on the other side, a person's impact, you know, that became bigger. And then it also felt that, I've had, brothers and sisters in arms that have been on far more deployments than me. I mean, I've had best friends that got home from a deployment, got transferred to a new duty station, and then boom, deployed. And it was a story for them as well of those constant deployments of, you come home from Iraq, all right, now you get to go to Afghanistan and vice versa. So it became more than just me. It became, everybody I knew, a little bit of their story and, building this overall book out, The Echo of Silence, into more than just a memoir of Brendan Kelly.
Yeah, and being able to combine lots of different stories, different elements from not just your life, but other people's lives, I think maybe makes the story a little bit more relatable because there might be someone who can pick one thing out
Yeah.
from that. It may not necessarily be from your story, but it might be from somewhere else that fits into the book itself, and they're able to take something away from it and, be able to figure out their own situation. Not say that necessarily a self-help book in that way, but sometimes you get those nice unexpected benefits sometimes when you're reading a book and you get just inspired or you get another idea of things. And it doesn't have to be a nonfiction book. You can get those ideas from just about anywhere. So it's
Yeah.
great that you're able to kind of combine some things and take a little creative liberties with some of it and make it into something that people can actually relate to. That's good. Yeah. The the book talks about, those invisible wounds that we were talking about, survival, forgiveness, all the processes behind healing and all that kind of stuff. For you, what was the kind of most personal of those aspects that you wrote about? And how do you think veterans will kind of connect with all of that?
The most personal really part that I wrote is, you know, my first deployment, the first battle scene where, you know, I took two lives. And, I shared that story because that was the, reoccurring nightmare I had for years. But it was also, I write this in the book as well. That is when I transitioned from basically being a older child in my young 20s, to an adult. My childhood was gone. So, writing that was a little intense. There was plenty of times I had to step back, uh, moments I cried, and moments I was very thankful that I'm here now and able to write that. So it was a very personable section. And I know, and I tried to keep it as real as possible. And my editor, was right on board with me, keeping it, you know, very realistic. And I know there are plenty of, military members out there that went through that exact same thing. And, they may handle it differently, later on in life. But if you're a military member, doesn't matter what branch, you've been deployed and you had to be in those situations, you'll know what Jack Mercer went through. You'll feel it. And I wanted it to be real because it is intense. It's hard, it's painful, but sadly that's life.
And that's got to be a hard thing to write about, relive those things and put it in such intimate details and things. I understand it's a fictional story, but still there's some grounding in the truth and reality with some of that as well. And so reliving some of that is very difficult, but you know, sometimes processing it in that way can help you get past it and get through it. And so, writing has like a strange effect that I found anyway in my own therapy and sessions that I've gone through where you start writing things. I obviously you can't write as fast as you think, and so it forces your brain to kind of slow down
Yeah.
and process some of that stuff a little bit more than you normally would have. Even just in this conversation here, if you were to describe all that to me, it'd be a lot quicker than if you were to take a pen and paper and just start writing it all down. Take you longer, and so of course you're going to process it a little bit slower, and it'll get more in depth in that processing. So yeah, it's definitely not easy. I know I've written a book myself, and mine was nonfiction, but the parts of the story that were the hardest to write were the ones that had the biggest impact on me, and they it took me a while to write those things because I had to stop and take lots of breaks because it was something sometimes it was just overwhelming, and
Absolutely.
but processing it is necessary too. You can't just, you know, box it up and shove it in the corner of your mind and never think about it again because it's gonna creep out. That box is not sealed tight, and it's gonna creep out, and it's gonna come out in ways maybe you don't expect, and so you kinda have to deal with it and learn how to handle those situations. So again, I'm not sure if we mentioned the name of your book, The Echo of Silence, the title of
Yes.
the book, right? So for folks who read the book, veterans especially, given the audience of this show, what do you hope stays with them after they finish the book?
Well, first and foremost, I hope they appreciate it for, its honesty, its clarity, and I hope they take from it, whether they're going through something or know someone that is going through something, that it's a call to action. That, hey, I'm going to pick up the phone and call my friend. It's been a bit, or I'm going to speak to someone. You know, at the end of the book, when the story's over, I include the hotline, the suicide hotline that's in there. And I appreciate my editor was on board with this because I want people to know you're not alone. There's someone to call. So I hope they take that, and hopefully, if needed, it'll give someone the strength just to, you know, get what they went through out. Even if it's to someone that may not understand, that's okay. If they're willing to listen, man, that's powerful. Just get it out and get that monkey off your shoulders.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So this story, this is your first
Yeah.
book that you've written, correct?
Yep.
In your mind, why was this the story that you felt you needed to tell first, and why now as opposed to 10 years from now, 5 years ago, whatever the case may be? What kinda gave you that spark and drive to get that story out there?
Well, once I realized that I had a bunch of pieces and I started putting together, I think something that, can drive me crazy is, when we talk about mental health and, we look in the media, the news, or read about it, too often they only bring it up if it's, someone famous that is going through something. And then they'll talk about it for a week and then it'll just go away. The facts are, I mean, we have far too many people, not just veterans, but people dealing with mental health issues, suffering from PTSD from various situations. And, their voices need to be heard. This isn't a random thing where we can do hey, this week is mental health awareness. This is a yearly thing. This has to be a focus for everybody. And, regardless of what someone's going through, you may think it's minor, but to them, it could be very powerful, very big. So I wanted to get it out there, this particular story, and try to let people know that, hey, this happens to a lot of people at various levels. And it needs to be a conversation that is spoken continuously. So here
Yeah,
I am.
but that's absolutely true. I definitely believe, we for too long have just kinda made mental health related issues taboo subjects and never really wanted to talk about it, or someone did go and talk to a therapist or whatever the case may be, and they were kind of looked at as like, oh my gosh, stay away from that person because that person might be
Yeah.
a little crazy or whatever. And like that was kind of the mindset like growing up, like you would hear about that even on, television shows and things like that. Someone's talking to counselor may make these funny looks well, it's really not that strange. Like, it's probably pretty cool to have these sort of feelings and emotions, and sometimes just know what to do with it because maybe it's a new thing to you, and maybe even if it's not a new thing, it's been around, you just haven't dealt with it way and don't know how to handle it. So, just anything else in life. I mean, you were a teacher. Those kids walking into the classroom didn't know the stuff that you were teaching them, and if they did, they wouldn't be in that classroom. They'd be in some other classroom, and so. You're sitting there teaching them, and they are taking something away from that because you're able to impart some sort of knowledge given the context of the class and all that kind of stuff. Just like, a therapist or a counselor should be able to do that type of thing for anyone of their patients as well, where they come in and I have this situation that I'm dealing with. I just don't know how to deal with it and help me out with this. And, they should be able to help you figure that out. I'm sort of going to say this is the exact right answer and you have to do it this way because everybody's a little bit different, but they'll give you the tools, the resources, and help you help yourself in that way.
Yeah.
So yeah, I figure it's important that you described that, like this, why this was a story that you need to tell and why it came out this way. So anything else before we wrap up here? Like where can people go to copy the book or to learn more about you and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. The book, The Echo of Silence, we're now looking at a May release. So it'll be out very soon. You can do pre-orders. It's available on my website at www.brendantkelly.com. You can find me on Instagram by the same name. And, whether it's to buy my book or you just want to say hello and, let me know your battles. You're not alone. I'll do my best to respond. Knock on wood, I'm pretty good at it. So, yeah.
Well, excellent. And, again, for the listeners, the book, The Echo of Silence, I will have a link to the book and Brendan's website and all that in the show notes. So you can check that out when this episode comes out here. You'll be able to hopefully grab a copy of the book and learn more about his story and all the things that kind of go into it through the website. Brendan, thank you so much for coming on the show, sharing your background, your thoughts, your insights on mental health related things, transition out of the military, all these types of things. So I really do appreciate you coming on. Thanks for your willingness to be open and sharing, with this type of stuff. And again, for the listeners, check those links out in the show notes. And
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
thank